Hi, everybody, and thank you for taking interest in the Colchester Avenue Scoping Study Project and tuning into this recording of the Alternatives presentation. My name is Drew Gingras, and I'm joined by my colleague Karen Sentoff. We're members of the consultant team with VHB, and we'll be presenting this material to you. For everyone's information, there will also be a live virtual presentation of this material on January 11th, 2021 at 6:30 p.m. alongside the CCRPC and the City of Burlington. On this date, we'll be presenting the material as we are here, and in addition, we'll be soliciting public feedback about these alternatives that we're presenting. For those unable to attend the live presentation, if you'd like to provide feedback, please feel free to use the contact information included at the end of this recording. Just to briefly walk through the agenda that we'll be going over with you today, we'll be providing introductions virtually of the project team, and as well as reviewing the purpose and need statement for this scoping study. They will then provide everybody a brief project refresher of work done today, and then get into the nitty gritty of the review and discussion of the corridor and intersection concepts that we're evaluating, followed by in person on the 11th discussion and feedback, and then a quick review of what's next to come. So the project, as we know, is being led by the CCRPC and the City of Burlington, with again myself and my colleague Karen Sentoff, as well as our colleague Jen Conley representing the consultant team with VHB, and we are assisted by Diane Meyerhoff at Third Sector Associates. Then also there is the key advisory committee that is made up of the stakeholders included on this slide.
Thanks, Drew, for the introduction. So we developed a project purpose and needs statement through existing conditions, assessments, gathering local concerns, and identifying opportunities and constraints along the corridor. The purpose and needs statement really helps guide decision-making regarding the potential solutions for the corridor. And this project's purpose and needs statement has really helped to narrow the many potential concepts for the study into the selection of alternatives that we're presenting to you today. The project purpose is to identify and prioritize improvements that align with the city's vision for sustainable transportation infrastructure and enable continuous, connected, and livable multimodal transportation corridor. Specifically, the study evaluates improvements along Colchester Avenue, which will enhance mobility and safety, and include solutions for parking demand, and at the intersection of East Avenue, which will improve safety for all modes. The needs of the study were defined as the need to improve intersection safety, improve corridor safety, enhance mobility for bicyclists, and include solutions for parking demand of local businesses, employers, and residents. And since we took a bit of a hiatus from the project, we thought a quick refresher seemed appropriate. So if you'll recall, last December, we had a local concerns meeting. Through multiple meetings with the advisory committee and the project team, we translated the existing conditions assessments we had done and those local concerns gathered from the community into opportunities and constraints. These opportunities and constraints, along with the project purpose and needs statement, really provided the guidebook for development of alternatives for the corridor. It's important to note that there were really a broad range of concepts considered for the corridor, and acknowledge the efforts of the advisory committee and the project team to really narrow those concepts into a viable set of alternatives. This was particularly true for the bike mobility enhancements on the corridor. There were many options considered to improve bicycle mobility, including two-way cycle tracks, but ultimately, from the many options listed here, we narrowed them down to a set of really feasible solutions for the corridor. And the table you see on your screen here is our guide for the presentation. Summarizes the corridor concepts and intersection alternatives developed for the study. The rows of the tables are the components shown together for the purposes of the presentation. So for consistency along the corridor concepts west and east go together as shown. For instance, concept 1 west is paired with concept 1 east. Concept 2 west, however, could be paired with concepts 2, 3, 3A, or 4 east. Although intersection alternatives are shown here with specific corridor concepts, the intersection alternatives are intended to work with really any of the corridor concepts. For comparison purposes, we'll work our way from left to right in this table, first discussing the west concepts, then the east, and then the intersection alternatives. It is important to note that short-term improvements have been exhausted along this corridor, and is really what exists out there on the road today. And so all of the alternatives that are considered here really require roadway reconstruction due to shifting curbs around. For those that have been involved in the project previously or have been tracking the progress, we just wanted to note that these concepts have been renamed for the ease of comparison in this presentation. So we wanted to make sure this information was available to refer back to if needed. And we will begin with those concepts for the west end of the corridor, west of the intersection with East Avenue between South Prospect Street and East Ave. And concept 1 west really changes the curb to curb width to better accommodate on-street separated bike lanes with buffers and a vertical element. So here you are seeing concept 1 west both in cross-section view at the top and plan view at the bottom. Some important features to note for this concept include that we are shifting curbs to accommodate travel lanes and bike lanes within the curb. Here we are holding the existing back of sidewalk along the corridor, so changes in this concept fall within that area. The newly constructed shared use path on the south side is flanked by a narrow green belt, and the on-street bike lanes have a 3-foot buffer with a vertical element like a bollard. As we continue along the corridor from the previous slide, here we're seeing the section between the UVM Medical Center entrance and East Avenue. For the moment, let's ignore the East Avenue intersection since we'll get into that a little bit later in the presentation. The features for this concept that differ from the previous section is that here we're extending beyond the existing back of sidewalk by about 4 feet to accommodate the changes. Again, we are seeing that newly constructed shared use path on the south side, and that would be retained throughout this section.
All right, thanks for going over concept 1 for the west, Karen. Now we'll look at the second concept for the west end of the corridor, which presents raised and separated bike lanes. Now, as you'll see in the cross section on the top of the page and the layout, that the bike lanes in this case are both horizontally and vertically separated from the roadway. This design will also have a slight vertical separation from the sidewalk to clearly define the space for each mode of bicyclists or pedestrians. Now, there's enough width here to call for grass strips wide enough in this section to allow for tree plantings as well. And even with the width widened grass strip, the area of impact does not extend beyond the existing backup sidewalk or backup shared use path on the south side. And given the vertical separation of this particular corridor concept, there's naturally more space for bikes and peds to operate separated from traffic. And continuing along this section, the grass strip does narrow. However, there's still enough space for a key feature of this particular concept, and that is a space provided for 2-stage left turns for bicyclists out of the street. And this became an apparent need during our local concerns meeting, as there was a desire for improving conditions for east to west traveling bicyclists to access driveways or roadways or intersections along the corridor. And this concept accomplishes that while keeping the turning bicyclists separate from vehicle traffic and separate out of the way of through bicycle traffic and pedestrians. Now, in order to better understand the impact and implication of these design concepts, we've developed evaluation matrices to compare the side-by-side critical concept factors as listed here, being cost, safety, impact of the built environment, and community character. Now, it's important to note that the cost evaluations are presented on a relative cost scale, as in one versus the other. So in our case, as Karen touched on, the big kind of cost generated for each of these concepts is always going to be the relocation of the curb that comes with the widening of the roadway and significant reconstruction as a result. And now the larger cost for concept 2 in this case comes from the design implications of raising the bike lanes to being slightly separated from roadway and sidewalk grade, as opposed to just striping them in the concept 1. Now, the two concepts provide protected and separated facilities for all modes using this corridor, being pedestrians, bicyclists, and vehicles. And as a result, we see improvements to safety across the board. The main difference in these two concepts is that we're thinking that we may not see the quote unquote interested but concerned cyclist population with the on street separated facility design, as there is still a certain level of perceived exposure to vehicular traffic when you're on the same grade operating as a bicyclist. Whereas these users are more likely to be comfortable along a raised and separated facility. And we've called out that these concepts also see improvements to pedestrian safety as well, because bicyclists currently using the shared use path along the south side will now have their own exclusive facility. And similar to the safety, we have similar impacts across the board for these alternatives in assessing this list of impacts we see here. And utilities will need to be shifted or relocated as a result of the shifting curbs and greenbelt. And as we have mentioned, all of the lower impact improvements have been made on the corridor. So when it comes to constructability with any of these alternatives, we see a major effort for that particular part of the evaluation of these alternatives. And then there is no existing parking along the corridor, therefore no change. And then we are anticipating moderate impacts to some existing trees, given the modifications proposed to the tree belt. And as far as the final evaluation matrix row here for community character, concept 1 generally holds the existing aesthetic character of the corridor, while concept 2 we see as an improvement, given the improvements made to the greenbelt by widening it nearly the full length of the corridor, and in particular widening it to the west of the UVM Medical Center driveway to allow for tree plantings.
Thanks, Drew. Now we're going to jump into the eastern end of the corridor. We will go through a number of concepts for the sections between along Colchester Avenue, between East Avenue and Barrett Street. Like the western sections of the corridor, concept 1 east changes the curb-to-curb width to better accommodate on-street separated bike lanes with buffers and a vertical element. So the key features to note with this concept are similar to concept 1 west, where there was a 5-foot bike lane and 3-foot buffer with that vertical element. In this section, however, there are a number of driveways, so the locations available for those vertical elements will be limited to allow access into those driveways. Although the right-of-way line, which you're seeing here in sort of the pink color, is beyond the back of sidewalk, we attempted to limit the impacts to those adjacent properties where that generous right-of-way space is utilized as folks' front yards and off-street parking space. Along this section, there's a minimal green belt. There's one segment between the Centennial entrance and Green Mountain Cemetery where we'd expand that green belt, allowing for space for trees and other plantings. The segment in front of the Green Mountain Cemetery and around the curve in Colchester Avenue would require no green belt, just to avoid the significant slope work that would need to be done in order to extend beyond the sort of existing back of sidewalk as it is today. And here you're seeing a continuation of the concept between Green Mountain Cemetery and Barrett Street. We again have that 5-foot bike lane with the 3-foot buffer and a vertical element. We're showing a minimal green belt, even though we are well within the right of way, again, to limit that impact to the adjacent properties, the space that folks are using as a front yard and off-street parking space. And again, to limit the width of the impacts, we have carried that minimal green belt along this segment.
All right, continuing with concept 2, still being the raised and separated bike lanes along the eastern section of the corridor. It is worth noting that while the cross section shown represents the majority of the corridor, it's not indicative of the entire length. In this case, particularly east of the campus kitchen location, you'll see on the layout view that our grass strip actually widens from the 3 feet shown in the cross section to, again, the 6 feet, similar to west of the UVM driveway, and allows for potential tree plantings in this location. And then, similar to concept one, as Karen noted, because of the um, kind of constrained topography around the Green Mountain Cemetery, we'll see in all concepts that as we narrow there, we lose any sort of grass strip or green belt around the curve that then heads down the hill towards Barrett. And then, as we can see, east of the cemetery, the grass strip returns. However, it is kept narrow at that 3 foot width shown in the cross section. And this is primarily to avoid any impacts, any further impacts to the space currently utilized by residents behind the back of existing sidewalk. And now we have our new concept 3 for the eastern section of the corridor. And this is just a reminder that for mobility, being mobility representing bicyclists and pedestrians at this cross section is generally the same as concept 2. The big difference here comes with the enhancements being made in an attempt to address the need for parking for residents and parking to support the local businesses along this section of the corridor. And we can see that while the cross section is similar to concept 2, there is the addition of the on-street parking. And this truly represents the balance of trying to implement this parking while maintaining consistent facilities for bicyclists and pedestrians and other users along the corridor. And given the presence of businesses such as Kathy's Flowers and Campus Kitchen, there was an express need during our local concerns and early public outreach efforts. There was an express interest for parking to be retained along this segment of the corridor as much as possible. And that's what we've tried to show here. And now east of this slide, or east of this section, excuse me, the down to Barrett Street, the cross section and layout remain the same as concept 2. So we're gonna skip ahead right into what we're referring to as concept 3A. And this concept was born as conversations developed with Campus Kitchen. It was noted that there was a strong desire to evaluate the possibility of maintaining short-term parking that would allow for high street parking and loading and unloading immediately in front of their location as it currently exists today. And as a result, this specialized concept 3A was created. And so concept 3A really mimics concept 3, as I'm sure you could have guessed, in its inclusion of on-street parking in select lower impact areas while also pursuing on-street parking immediately in front of Campus Kitchen. Now, given the need to balance space for all users in this tighter cross section, this concept calls for a change to the corridor dynamics for bicyclists and pedestrians for the short section. And that is highlighted in yellow on this slide, which is the creation of what we're calling a mixing zone, or similar to a shared use path, immediately along the frontage of Campus Kitchen. And given the nature of vehicular turnover in this location and parking and accessing Campus Kitchen, the project team believes it makes sense to really encourage slower movement speeds, particularly among bicyclists at this location, and create this shared space mixing zone. And so that's what we've tried to do here in this short section with the narrow 8-foot shared use path across the frontage. And what we see this concept as truly representing a compromise for all modes in the greater interest of addressing all of the needs of the projects as previously stated.
All right, and with concept 4 East, we're taking a similar approach to the existing western section of the corridor, where that shared use path that was recently put in helps to accommodate both bicyclists and pedestrians on one side of the roadway. So this is taking from that idea that's out in the existing condition. And here we're seeing that shared use path on the north side of the corridor. This is coupled with the raised separated bike facility and sidewalk on the south side. And putting that shared use path on the north side was really in anticipation of slow uphill cyclists, so folks coming up from the Winooski Bridge. The speed of the uphill cyclists makes mixing both bikes and peds more tolerable along this section. of the corridor. And maybe it's just important to note here that the back of sidewalk in this concept is generally within 1 to 2 feet of the existing back of sidewalk along this stretch. And here's a continuation of that concept between Greenmount Cemetery and Barrett Street. The shared use path in this case is on the west side of the corridor, or the uphill side of Colchester Avenue through this steep section. This again is coupled with that raised separated bike lane and sidewalk on the east side, or downhill side of this segment. The intent really is to mix the slow uphill cyclists with pedestrians, but go ahead and separate the pedestrians and faster downhill cyclists on the downhill side. And this design would stay within 1 to 2 feet of the existing back of sidewalk in terms of the impacts.
All right, and that wraps up the eastern section concepts. And so, as we've mentioned, for the evaluations of these concepts similar to the west end, these matrices, were developed to compare each of these concepts to each other, assessed against the same four project characteristics, being cost, safety, impacts, and overall community character. And so these costs are once more presented on a relative scale. And for this assessment, concept one was evaluated lower on the scale, as the only significant impact is widening of the curb to curb width and residual work that comes from that, whereas concepts 2 through 4 include that work in addition to establishing new raised and separated facilities off street, as we've discussed. Now, looking at the safety along the corridor in general, the concepts are providing improvements over the existing conditions because, for the most part, we are providing a complete separation of various modes. Now, there are slight discrepancies when looking at concepts 3A and 4. Concept 3 brings in the trade-off of accommodating additional parking with creating a shared mixing zone for bicyclists and pedestrians for a short section. And similarly, concept 4 has a shared facility along the north side for bicyclists and pedestrians traveling in the uphill or westbound direction. And as a result, we're calling this out as a combination of no change and or a slightly worse case for pedestrians for these concepts, based on the fact that in the existing condition, pedestrians have their own space, being their sidewalk, and in the proposed concepts, we're proposing to share that space between bicyclists and pedestrians. And lastly, all concepts represent an improvement to vehicular safety, given that the travel lanes are now exclusively for vehicles rather than shared adjacent to the existing buffered bike lanes, or in some cases, the shared lane condition. Now, the impacts shown of the corridor concepts on the eastern segment are fairly consistent across these concepts as well. As we've touched on, all concepts will have impacts to utilities and will require likely significant construction and relocation. And in this assessment, evaluating parking and right-of-way impacts kind of goes hand in hand in a way. As we've discussed, while none of the concepts being considered have actual private right-of-way impacts, concepts 3 and 3A naturally require more space to accommodate on-street parking alongside the proposed multimodal facilities. And while these do not encroach into private parking, but rather impact space within public right-of-way that is currently being utilized by residents, whether that is for driveway parking or general recreation. And regarding impacts to trees, all concepts are anticipated to have some level of impact, with concept 3 and 3A having slightly more significant impacts, given the need, again, for more width in those cases. Right. To reiterate, the community character is really focused on, does this concept improve aesthetics and meet the project purpose and need? So while we see improvements to the aesthetics for the grass strip due to the grass strip and proposed tree belts in some cases for concepts 2 through 4, we need to look at that last row, which is, does the alternative or concept satisfy the project purpose and need? And we see these asterisks as called out as being representative of not entirely addressing the parking needs for the reasons that we see here. And we know, as we touched on, the parking need outside of campus kitchen, for instance, for that high turnover location, so that customers can still utilize and have space to utilize parking to access the campus kitchen there, and then as well as identifying, looking at the parking and identifying the potential for additional parking opportunities adjacent to the corridor, which isn't really seen in these concepts, but we in the city have had discussions with UVM in pursuit of public parking in the Centennial lot, which currently has 2 driveways. Discussions have happened there. Can we potentially reallocate some of that space for parking, for public parking? And then there's also been an intentional effort with the neighborhoods in pursuit of residential on-street parking by area instead of by street, given what we know about parking utilization. And then there have also been and are continuing ongoing discussions regarding privately owned lots in the project area that could potentially be used for residential use. Now, we're going to be taking a closer look, tracking back to the west to the intersection of Colchester Avenue and East Avenue and the alternatives that we have developed for that. And the first alternative we'll look at, staying on theme, is the lowest overall impact option, which in this case is ultimately upgrades to the equipment, being the signal equipment and the striping. And Karen will get into this a little bit more in a few slides, but in evaluating crash data at this intersection, the majority of the crashes that occur here are rear end type. And generally, this is indicative of poor signal head visibility. Now, through our investigations to date, we found that the signal equipment relative to the lane configurations and alignment is not up to standard. So this first alternative proposes relocating that equipment, as well as providing more bolstered pavement markings to improve the conspicuity of all other modes through this intersection. The second alternative we'll look at is slightly more intensive, involving a realignment of East Avenue as well as those same signal relocations and upgrades at this intersection. Now, as we know, there's a less than desirable skew at the intersection of Colchester Avenue and East Avenue, and this alternative would propose to realign East Avenue to bring it in at a 90-degree angle with Colchester Avenue. Now, this will help in addressing visibility concerns, as well as the concern that was brought up about the speeds, excuse me, at which left turns are made from Colchester Avenue onto East Avenue. The other significant change that will be made that will have a major impact on bicyclist comfort and safety at this intersection will be the design to keep bicyclists separated in the bike lane to the right of the travel lanes. And now this is only possible through the installation of a bicycle signal and separate bicycle-only phasing at the intersection, which are both proposed as part of the upgrades in this alternative.
And jumping into the third alternative for the intersection with East Avenue, it's similar to the concept Drew just shared, with the exception of the bike treatment. So in this alternative, the intersection is realigned with that upgraded equipment and relocated equipment, like in alternative 2, but in this alternative, the eastbound bike lane is brought up to the intersection between the vehicle through and turn lanes. The expectation here is that the bicyclists will then be served at the signal with the through traffic. In this option, the bicyclist is more exposed than with the dedicated bike signal concept that Drew had just shown. And the fourth alternative for the intersection with East Avenue is carrying forward what we've seen from previous planning efforts, and that is to have a roundabout at this location. The roundabout, similar to the realignment options, would square up the intersection, bringing East Avenue in closer to a 90-degree angle with Colchester Avenue and realigning that entrance to Trinity campus. The roundabout would have an inscribed diameter of 110 feet, as shown here, and would formalize the crossings for bikes and peds at all 4 approaches. So that's really providing more access than is available to bicyclists and pedestrians in the existing configuration. And similar to the corridor concepts, the intersections were also evaluated through cost, safety, impacts, and community character metrics. So the relative cost of each intersection treatment ranges from simply upgrading and relocating equipment and striping, all the way up to the significant reconstruction work that would be involved in realignment or roundabout. All right, so in terms of safety, for the vehicle safety evaluations of these alternatives, we turned back to the Highway Safety Improvement Program evaluation conducted for this intersection. That report really identified the predominant crash type at this high crash location as rear-end type crashes. These occur often when the light has just turned red and the second vehicle fails to stop, or just as the light has turned green. And these crashes are really indicative of the signal head visibility issues that Drew had mentioned earlier. The report attributed these issues to poor alignment of the signal heads with each lane, the pedestal mounted equipment that's out there, and lack of signal head back plates. So all of the signalized intersection options presented here would update the equipment that's out there and relocate it appropriately. The recommendations from the report to realign East Avenue and realign the UVM driveway are also considered in Alternative 2 and Alternative 3. Alternative 4 would lower vehicle speeds and have fewer conflict points just by way of that roundabout design. And because of this, the roundabout was considered to be a significant improvement over the existing condition for vehicular safety. For bike safety, separation of bikes at the intersection through a dedicated signal and phase that's presented in Alternative 2 would really be an improvement over the other alternatives. And then in terms of pedestrian safety, the signal protected crossings here were considered the greatest improvement to safety. The impacts of the intersection treatments were compared side by side, as you're seeing on your screen. In all 4 cases, there would be major impacts to utilities and minor impacts to right-of-way. For Alternative 1, this would involve new and or relocated mast arm poles and mast arms, and more minor effort in terms of constructability. For the other alternatives, the major roadwork required for realignment or for a roundabout development would be pretty significant. For the realignment and roundabout intersection treatments, there would be a reduction of 2 to 3 parking spaces along East Avenue and some minor tree impacts where there's 1 to 2 trees immediately adjacent to the intersection today that would be affected by the major reconstruction efforts involved in these 3 alternatives. And then finally, in archaeological assessment of the corridor recommended that areas along the edge of the UVM Trinity campus, any areas in that space disturbed beyond the right-of-way really should undergo additional review as part of the design and construction. And finally, in terms of community character, the alternatives that leverage curbing to separate facilities and provide greenbelt spaces are considered improvements to the aesthetics of the intersection. So that includes Alternatives 2 and 4. All of the intersection alternatives would satisfy the purpose and need, particularly in terms of safety. So the upgrades to the equipment and striping would address the primary recommendations from that Highway Safety Improvement Program report. And realignments in Alternatives 2 and 3 would address the secondary recommendations from that report. The roundabout alternative would similarly provide significant improvements to safety at this high crash location intersection.
All right, thank you, Karen, for reviewing all of the intersection alternative concepts there. And so that just about brings us to the end here. A quick review of our next steps represent a preferred alternative refinement, followed by a meeting with our advisory committee meeting, which will be our final meeting. And then the selected preferred alternative from that will be presented to the city council for approval. And just for everybody's benefit, again, if you have any feedback that you'd like to provide prior to the live meetings scheduled for January 11th, please do so to Jason Charest at the CCRPC, who is the project manager for this scoping study. And feel free to pause the recording as needed and write his information down. And we look forward to hearing from everybody. And thank you for joining us today.